Welcome to another edition of Trending Topics with BB. I am your host, Brooke Brown. But before we get to that, I do want to remind all listeners out there, if you have not, log on to the official website, which is trendingtopicswithbbpodcast.com. There you will find all links to new episodes and our social media. And if you have Googled this podcast, which probably a lot of listeners have, then you have found that website regardless. But thank you to all current and past listeners of this podcast. I really appreciate it. And I apologize to those that have been reaching out at ttwithbbpod@gmail.com for new episodes. Sorry, we're on our way to more in 2020. But I just wanted to update you with the current housekeeping, as I call it on this podcast. But this is a very special episode because it is 2020, it is election year, and I'm fired up because fuck this election. But before we get that, I want to introduce my guest. My guest has been on this podcast twice, but I figured that we needed discussion as opposed to me just ranting and raving about my angry rants of the election. So welcome. Introduce yourself.
Well, my name is Marcus, so thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, let's just be clear to all of you who have been listening to this podcast for 6 years, or let's just even go back 3.5 years. My first soapbox episode was my disdain for Donald Trump when he started running, and obviously that didn't help. But I feel like a little bit more discussion has to be said about the entire election process and this election thus far. We have just basically been bamboozled, and I will get to that in a minute. But my first question is, let's just talk about the fact that we are currently in a state of affairs in the U.S. where it is hanging on a reverse pattern of whether we get a Republican or a Democrat as our president, the two-party system. And as a democracy, that's really not how you define a democracy, as just two parties. I know we offline have talked about the problems with this, but let's just kind of make it so for those who find this episode or this podcast will understand why the thinking of the two-party process needs to change. And first, you have been not part of any of these parties, and I am a self-proclaimed nonpartisan. So explain to me what your frustration is just with the two-party system.
My frustration with the two-party system? Well, my frustration is that my beliefs aren't represented squarely by either party. I mean, and the interesting thing is I think most people would agree with that. But at the same time, people aren't willing to try to figure out how to change that. I mean, are you just going to pick the lesser of two evils every time and then hope that someday there can be somebody who's not evil? I mean, without doing anything? So that's my thought with it, is that you have to be willing to do something about it and try to figure out what is it that we can do about it to change that. Because the thing that's the problem is that the party, you basically only have one of two options on the ballot. So that's a problem. So what are you going to do? You're going to write in the candidate you want and have 0% chance of that actually happening, or do you want to vote for a third party and try to improve the chances of a third party becoming a viable option? So it's a big thought of how do we change it, or should we even change it and just continue to vote for the lesser of two evils?
Right, and I agree. So since I brought it up, let's go back to 2016. So personally, I'm just going to throw it out there. I was one of the popular millions that voted for Hillary. Now, before you get on your high horse about whether you hate or like Hillary, I personally don't hate, but I personally don't like Hillary. I voted for Hillary because I really thought that she could run the country swimmingly better than Trump has done for 3 years. And I'm still correct in this assessment. However, she has some issues, and I'm not talking about the emails. I could fucking care about what email she used. At this point, I could care about... I mean, an article came out this week about Ivanka using a personal email. Who the fuck cares? My point being is, foreign policy, yes, Hillary had way more experience because, A, her husband was a former president, B, she was a Secretary of State, and she's a senator for New York. So she had political experience in dealing with other governments as well as within the establishment, if you want to call it. However, because of such propensity in her being one of the proponents within the political system as it is, I think that harmed her electability, and that's why people, well, really the Electoral College, the electorates voted for Trump, was because they wanted somebody different that wasn't necessarily represented before within American politics. So it was a whole clusterfuck of a problem in 2016 because the media bias painted Hillary as a shoo-in, but nonetheless, everybody was just lying and basically went and voted for Trump regardless of... I mean, there was still a popular vote. She still won the popular vote, but my point being is the electorates lied saying they were going to go for Hillary and then went for Trump in my assessment. Whether that was true, whatever. The point I'm trying to make is it can't, like you just mentioned, come down to the lesser of the two evils. Like I said, I don't necessarily agree with everything Hillary has done or did. I don't necessarily, definitely, as people have listened to this podcast before, no, I am not a Trump supporter. But when a significant amount of population of this country is disenfranchised with how the system is going for them personally, which is why they voted for Trump in 2016, because he promised things, he could make things better. Obviously, he was lying. That's a whole other story. You would think people would start to realize that maybe the political system as it is needs to change, and they need to realize that a democracy doesn't need to boil down to two all the time. There should be a better playing field of more candidates, or people should actually know who is running as an independent, who is running as a green member of that party, who's running as another party, because you won't know that until we show up for the general election in November, and you'll see that there's 3 other candidates listed there, but you haven't heard a fucking word about them in the media.
Yeah.
And that's happened for the last 3 elections I've been able to vote.
Somehow they were still able to get on the ballot, yet somebody like, let's say, Bernie Sanders might not even be able to get on the ballot.
Yeah. So let's talk about
that.
So this leads into why I talked about being bamboozled. I like using the bamboozled term because, well, it's a reference to Friends, but also a lot of things. So this election has been interesting. There was like 25 fucking DNC registered candidates. Obviously, the big well-knowns that made a name for themselves were Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg. I would say people know who Amy Klobuchar and Tulsi Gabbard are now, but in the long run, they were still kind of in the back burner. But then the funny thing about this entire election was that Joe Biden was begged to basically run by many, probably people within the DNC, as well as just celebrities and you name it. And at first, he was reluctant to run. Because I remember he came in when all the others started running in 2017, and at least acknowledge that they were going to run. Biden would say, oh, fuck that, I'm not running. Or I have to talk to my family about this. Just kind of brush it off, saying that he really was, reluctant to run. And so he didn't initially run when a lot of the others put their name in the ring. And then all of a sudden he comes out of nowhere and says, yeah, I'm running. The way he did it was a little like, oh, why would he announce it this way? But that's neither here or there. So, but in the process of this entire election, we're here on 2020, the people are voting in the primary. And for months now, the media and people themselves have said publicly that they counted Biden out. before Super Tuesday. That because his campaign failed to raise the amount of money that other campaigns did, such as Warren, such as a Sanders, such as a Buttigieg, that there was no way he would get past Super Tuesday. And then 2 days before Super Tuesday, he wins one state, which is South Carolina, or North Carolina, one of the Carolinas, out of nowhere. And people are like, oh, he won a state. And then on Super Tuesday, he actually got more delegates and won more states, beating Bernie Sanders. And that made Pete bow out. That made...
Well, Pete bowed out before.
But then he endorsed Biden, which is suspect. And then Warren now has said, has bowed out, but she hasn't endorsed either one yet. And a few, obviously the others were dropping like flag. Bloomberg hasn't endorsed anybody because Bloomberg's just weird and trying to do some of his own campaigning. He has an endorsement from Clint Eastwood, if that says enough. But...
Well, Bloomberg endorsed Biden, all right. Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, he did.
So, the point I'm trying to make is... we got bamboozled, and I say we because the
thing about it is that it's a bait and switch, in my opinion. They're like, oh, look at all these interesting candidates. Oh, you like one? That's great. Yeah, you're part of our party. You're the Democratic Party. You like a candidate. You like Yang. You're in the Democratic Party. Psych. You can't vote for Yang. You have to vote for Biden.
Yeah, let me bring that up. I mentioned all these frontrunners and ones you may have heard of, but I was never... I will take this back. I was a supporter of Kamala Harris before she dropped out. And then now, with today's new headline we'll get to in a minute, not kind of liking the trail she's blazing. But then I became part of the Yang gang, and still part of the Yang gang, even though Andrew Yang has dropped out. I liked Pete for about a minute, but I thought Pete would be better as maybe a VP or somebody in the cabinet, and he still may be probably Biden's Secretary of State at this point, because if he was quick to endorse Biden, there's got to be some sort of funny business of promising people cabinet positions at this point.
Yeah, there's probably that, but then there's also, I think, just the deep state actors working behind the scenes. The same ones that convinced Biden to even run are the same ones that actually convinced Pete to run. Because Pete, when he first joined the race, he was like, I never expected to be here. Kind of so I think the establishment's like, we need Pete, we need you to run. Biden, we need you to run. And here's how we're going to orchestrate it. We'll have Pete leave, gain a bunch of support, leave right before Super Tuesday, throw his delegates to Biden. I think that was all planned out, to be honest.
Which very may well be, and you know me. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and you are. But at this point, with all the funny business going on and the fact that now Biden's the front runner, right, it probably will be the nominee, which will push out Bernie yet again. Right. Because, let's go back to 2016 for a second. Bernie should have beat Hillary, but because of the funny business in the primary and the fact that the superdelegates and the DNC were like, we don't want Bernie, but Hillary was the nominee, and then here we are with Trump for 4 years. So there's theories. My theory in that, even though I'm not a conspiracy theory, is they just don't like the change of the party guard in terms of what Bernie and even Warren...
Because he's not establishment. The establishment has their set order. And an independent person who isn't sold out to the establishment, didn't sell out to get to their current position, and they're not willing to sell out to become president, they're a threat because they have different ideas than what the establishment has in terms of how to run the country, how things should be, etc. So a candidate like Tulsi Gabbard or a candidate like Bernie, maybe even Elizabeth Warren, obviously a candidate like Trump, completely disrupts the order that they have. And it's an order they set up so that they can profit themselves. They know the order, they set up the order so they can profit. They can get an edge. Their businesses can get an edge, etc. So if somebody else comes in there with new ideas on how to, let's say, level the playing field or improve the economy or whatever it is, those ideas are disruptive to those who are currently in power.
Right. So as we've kind of discussed, in my allegiance to none of the parties, but because of there was so much diversity in the 25 different candidates that ran in the DNC, I had hope that we would find somebody running as a Democrat to actually be true to some of the ideals that people associated with the party. However, at this point, I'm not convinced that they're aligning with majority of the generation, which would be our generation now, because they're not understanding that it's not cut and dry as, oh, well, I support this issue, you don't support this issue. No, there's a lot of gray area now within politics and also within issues that are affecting citizens of this country and people who are wanting to come to this country as immigrants, because, newsflash, we're an immigration country. So I think the disenfranchise that people experienced from the last election and thinking that Trump was going to do something, whether they're still Trump supporters, that's their own prerogative. But with the ability to have this many different candidates, there was hope that maybe, you could find a candidate that whether they were actually a Democrat or Republican, because there's this notion that, A, you have to run as a Democrat or Republican, even if you're actually not entirely part of the party, which you just mentioned Bernie is. And I agree. Bernie, as a socialist or whatever people want to call him, he's not a Democrat. I really see him maybe as an independent or just a nonpartisan in general. But that's a whole story. So just like when Trump ran as a Republican, because of the track of you either have to choose one or the other in opposing elections, there's a problem with finding, not, as you say, being a part of the establishment as it exists. I mean, you well know me that, like, I don't necessarily agree with all conspiracies, but at this point, when you had more women running than we've ever seen, you had more people of color running, and now they're all out, and it's still down to 2 old white men who, at the end of the day, probably believe in the same things because they're around the same age, in their 70s, regardless of...
And they're, part of the well-to-do class.
Yeah, they're part of the 1%.
Yeah.
So there's
not much
as much as Bernie plans to help people get out of debt with college and the universal health care, which I agree, he's part of the 1%. How much can he actually relate as being a career politician for 40 years to those people who are homeless right now? To those people that are struggling to get a green card?
He might have what he thinks and what many think to be decent solutions to help people that are poor or whatever. But at the same time, he hasn't really experienced it to really know how to help them. His idea is put a tax on stock trading to help the poor. That's not somebody that lived on the streets would come up with. That's something somebody from an ivory tower would think of. Somebody on the streets would be like, just help me out with some water, or help me find a job, help, give me some resources, stuff like that, So, again, even though he has what he thinks are good ideas, I don't think that he's really walked the walk enough to have the best ideas on how to help people.
Yeah, and this is where I get at, is that I'm probably going to piss off a lot of you Bernie supporters out there with this, but you're part of a new age cult. I hope you realize that. I hope you realize that, yes, your hope from 2016 or 2015 when you were like, feel the burn, and the whole... Well, I will give Bernie one thing. Side note, he has a great social media and marketing team to propose that you become part of this quote-unquote movement, but you're part of a cult. Whether you take that negatively or, whatever you want to take it, it's up to whoever's listening to this podcast. And as previous episodes, I've talked about the modern day cult. So, go back to that episode. But, at the same time, yeah, it's great to have support and get people mobilized in talking about the issues. Probably of the younger generation is great. But when November rolls around and they don't have their candidate representative that they actually got them fired up to care, they're not going to show up to vote. We've seen that time and again.
It's a funnel. You know, have you heard of funnels in marketing?
Yeah.
This primary is a funnel. It's like you get all these people that have all these diverse beliefs to believe in a candidate, and then you start pulling those candidates out one by one until you're just left with the one you want everybody to vote for. It's a funnel, you know. It's a fraud, really.
I mean, I more than anybody want anybody who turned 18 this year or last year to be just as fired up, if not more fired up, than the person that turned 80 this year.
And they want the establishment wants you to be fired up to vote for one of their candidates. Why don't we get fired up to change the system?
Exactly. That's the point of
that. We don't know how to do that. We don't know how.
Point.
That's what we need to figure out. How do we change the system?
Because many different countries, one actually really close to us, southern. I mean, Mexico has had many different political revolutions. Now, granted, they're still in an array, and you could chalk that up to a lot of different issues. But they, at least in the 80s, were like, we're going to fucking try to change the world with a new candidate and a revolution. And many countries have done this over the years. I mean, the Berlin Wall fell. There's a host of different historical significant elections out there in the world that have changed life, some for the worse, but some for the better. Now, when you talk about USA being the number one democracy in the world, how is it that we are constantly in a pattern of career established politicians that for how many years they've been in office, whether they're senators, House of Representatives, or just, a mayor of a town, how do we continue to just vote that way? I've gotten into many political discussions on social media, which is sad recently, about people just saying, well, I don't like the candidates. I don't like that Biden's going to probably win. I was Team Bernie or I was Team Warren. But at the end of the day, we just need to get Trump out. I agree. Trump is Satan. But at the end of the day, you're just perpetuating the same patterns. If you're just going to vote blue or vote red.
Plus, lots of people are like, well, let's just do it this time, and then next time we can change the system. Well, that'll keep going forever. There's always going to be a reason just this time to vote for the Democrat, or just this time vote for the Republican to get the other one out. But it's the hustle. That's a hustle. That's what a hustler makes you do. Well, no, just right now. You need to do it right now. You need to do this right now. That's what a hustler has you do. That's the whole point of a hustler, is that's what they do.
Right.
So we're getting hustled.
So the point I'm trying to make, I guess, with this episode, obviously, neither one of us in this conversation are agreeing with what's going down. Now, as a nonpartisan, I don't have an allegiance to either side. I never have. I've always said since the day I turned 18, even before the day I turned 18, I hate each side equally because I think they're both corrupt. I think there's flaws on both sides. There's no perfect party. There's no perfect candidate. If that was the case, why don't we just elect a robot at this point? But
actually, that's kind of scary because that actually might be
I know.
How things go.
But at this point, I don't want that to happen. Yeah. We're humans. We're flawed. We're not perfect. However, there should be some sort of willingness to look inside and look beyond the surface and see that something fishy went down with this fucking election. There was not that I'm not trying to be anti-Biden, but the point I'm trying to make is for somebody who was laid low, had the least amount of donors, and to win, to identify with a certain demographic within the South, which is black voters in the South. There's theories as to why. Obviously, he was the VP with Obama. And as somebody who's multiracial, I can see how black voters would want somebody who at least was supportive of such issues under the Obama administration. However, that is not, even as somebody of color myself who have experienced discrimination from the day I was born, you can't. That's great to think that there's somebody out there that will understand what you're going through, but that's not a reason to vote for somebody out of nowhere. I'm just a little confused as to why all of a sudden there's all this support in the South from black voters for Biden, when in reality you had Kamala Harris, you had Bernie, you had Warren, who actually have done stuff for the
if that were the case, let's say Biden just has a lot of grassroots support in the South. Why wasn't that showing in the polling?
Yeah, this is the point. Is the whole margin of error in the polling and all the bullshit that the media reports has completely.
There's something weird.
It's so fishy. It's so fishy. From the minute, like, obviously my gut instinct, I've never felt the burn. I'm not part of the Warren clan. I've mentioned I am part of others, but I
Warren tribe.
Whatever.
That's the Pocahontas thing.
Oh, forget that. I don't care if she's a name.
Everybody has a funny name: Yang Gang, Bernie Bros, and the Warren tribe.
But the point I'm trying to make is, we need to figure out what went down here. And to all of those people that are like, well, if you vote third party, you're just throwing your vote away. You've been bamboozled on the entire system. Because that's not a democracy. That's an authoritarian. That's a dictatorship if you have two choices.
Yeah.
Like, seriously? Like...
Yeah, you got
I'm not going to write in somebody. Like, I'm not going to write in Mickey Mouse. But I'm going to...
You can have a different favorite color, but you have to vote for either red or blue as your favorite color. You might like yellow, but you still got to pick red or blue.
Yeah. How is that a democracy?
No.
I mean, there needs... So I'm going to vote third party. Like, I've said this publicly, but I don't know who in the third party I'm going to vote for. But I feel like...
they're on the ballot.
Yeah. They're on the ballot. Your favorite Bernie or your favorite Warren is not going to be on the ballot now. And obviously, side note, I feel it's kind of fucked up that at least Tulsi Gabbard is staying in this. And she's trying to stick it to the man because she's really not a Democrat. She's an independent.
To be honest, like, I honestly
and yet
don't
there's
understand.
The DNC made up new fucking standards this last week to block her from being on the debate stage on Tuesday. So It's just down to fucking Biden and Bernie.
I mean, all of the other candidates could have stayed in. It's just, I honestly don't think that they really believe in what they're doing if they're not going to just stay until the end no matter what. I mean, that's what I would do. If I really believed in running and believed in my platform and message, why would I drop out? You know?
Yeah, I don't get that. And I think that's... Tulsi Gabbard just gained a lot of respect from me because granted she didn't do well on Super Tuesday, but she's like, fuck this, I'm staying in this until I have to get out. Yeah. And that is something that I would like in a politician. Not somebody that's going to go, oh, well, I guess I'm going to bow out, and, oh, well, he promised me I could, like, play with him, so I'm just going to endorse him and be on his good graces and play the political bullshit.
That's what establishment people would do, is they're all just trying to get ahead themselves. I mean, that's what it seems like to me. If people are bowing out, especially something like the Pete thing, where it's, like, obviously ulterior motives, I mean, they're just doing this for their own gain. It wasn't for the message. It wasn't for change. It was just to
now people know their name. They're a household name now.
That's a spooky thing. Yeah.
So, I guess in conclusion, we could go around on this discussion for as long as we want, but I felt that we needed to have this conversation because while the more people suppress and not have these conversations about politics, and don't get us wrong here, Marcus and I do not agree on everything. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're like, oh, there is a bunch of... No, we do not. In fact, we're quite different.
Very hard to find middle ground.
Yeah. However, we respect each other's sides and we have these conversations. We've had them offline, but we decided to record this one because it is important to talk about this. The more we suppress it, the more people are just not, going to be educated and not learn to respect their fellow man. And we're just going to continue in the world chaos that we are right now in terms of like, well, they don't understand me, everybody's ignorant. Well, how do you not become ignorant? You learn from others, you talk, you research, you do what you can. So, in this election year of 2020, I would hope that people would understand that it is my right, and I am not throwing my vote away if I vote third party. Because they'll actually be on the ballot in November. And so all of your tired energy and devotion to a Bernie Sanders, to Elizabeth Warren, to a Pete Buttigieg, to a Kamala Harris, to an Andrew Yang, at the end of the day, I won't be able to check their name off unless I write it in November.
Probably won't even be counted.
Exactly. Voter suppression is a whole nother story we could have a whole nother episode of this podcast on, about the fact that, having closed primaries in 2020 by state is bullshit. I should have been able, come Super Tuesday, to vote, just be registered as nonpartisan, and choose either ballot or just vote like I am in the general election. Why is it that in the primary in the majority of this country, you have to choose a party to vote? Like, I don't identify with any of the parties, as I've mentioned over and over again, but why am I forced, if I wanted to vote on Super Tuesday, to choose the Democratic ballot, because just to vote candidates in that I don't necessarily agree with, because they're the only ones going to be considered by the media until November? Like, that is not, again, authoritarian. How are we a freaking democracy if I don't have the freedom to choose?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, I want it to be entirely clear to those, and I know a lot of people listen to this podcast from all over the world and you're laughing at us right now because A, Trump's our president, and B, we're having this election. But I just want to be entirely clear that the grass is not always greener on the other side. But until then, we have to, if we believe in movements and we believe in political revolution, we have to believe in that we can protest the system by voting third party, by
whatever it is
that
you think. I mean, I don't know the answer on how best to go about it, but we can just try to figure out the facts and try to figure out the options and try to make the best decision, with the position that we're in.
So, going forward, do you think that this is going to be an election that, whether Trump gets reelected or whether we have Biden in the White House, because that's, again, how it's going, do you think this is going to wake up in a generation, or are we going to continue on this cycle?
Well, from a meta perspective, which is kind of what I like to look at the world in terms of, what I'm seeing happening is there's less need for parties. With social media, with podcasting, with YouTube, with other forms. Basically, we're democratizing influence. With things like, I really believe in Discord, which is like a chat room. A private chat room for whatever groups you want. But we're getting to a place where money, and as we're seeing with Bloomberg, money can't buy you influence. He had all the money. All the money. I mean,
he spent
$60 billion. That's 10 times richer than Trump.
Right, and he spent $500 million on ads.
So that proves that Trump had something besides just money. He had money, which helps. I mean, Bloomberg had zero without his money. But you look at his little mic bump of support, a few months ago or whatever, a couple months, and you realize that money can't buy you influence anymore. Going on Joe Rogan or starting up a really robust grassroots like Bernie, these are the things that are starting to become viable, and eventually, because right now everybody wants to be on a party ticket because then they have access to a lot of money, especially in terms of the general election. At this point, it would be hard to campaign in general election because the thing is, with a party, let's say you choose Republican, if you get the nomination against all odds,
which Trump is going to, because there's no anybody running against him.
I just mean, let's say Democrat, okay? So if you end up getting the nomination of the party, that means all of that party support, all of the DNC money is behind
RNC.
Is behind you in the general. But we're starting to figure out that it's not just money. You know, you can build a grassroots thing, and you won't need that party money for a general. So that's kind of what I'm seeing things go. I mean, I guess that's hopeful, but that's also just looking at the data, looking at actually how things are going right now. So it's about building influence, and if you can build it outside of a party, then that's going to be ideal for freedom kind of going forward.
Good ending note. All right, well, thanks, Marcus, for joining me again on my podcast. It was an interesting, illuminating discussion. For those out there that are like fearful of having these discussions, I highly recommend it. And for those that are new to this podcast, feel free to check out past episodes. And again, like I said, log on to the website for any updates regarding this podcast. And we will see you on another episode